I just want to apologize first for that break. I know I said be back at 11. We're a little bit late, but we're just going to keep going with the time schedule here. And right now we have a new format. It's called BG Dialogue, something that we haven't done before at the conference, so that's pretty cool. And we have Shinzen Young and David Vago. And I just want to start off with a little bit of a koan, if you will. What happens when you bring together a longtime meditation teacher interested in advanced mathematics and science with a Harvard neuroscientist who is an avid meditator? You get the Harvard brain study on Shinzen Young meditators. Together, Shinzen Young and David Vago have teamed up to investigate what happens in the brain when you actually apply Shinzen Young's meditation techniques. And lucky for us, they're going to reveal their data for the very first time here, so we're very fortunate for that. And their dialogue is called Mapping the Meditative Mind. Dave's going to present on the research and data for about 30 minutes. Shinzen will then come up and put that into an historical context. Unfortunately, we won't have time for Q&A, but the great news is they'll be leading an unplugged session later this afternoon where you can go and meet with them and discuss any questions you have or just anything that comes up for you to make up for that Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Shinzen Young and David Vago.
All right. Well, it's so wonderful to be here. And I really wanted to start by thanking the Buddhist Geeks conference organizers, and especially Vincent Kelly, for allowing or giving Shinzen and I the opportunity to geek out with you all today, really. It's just so wonderful. And also for providing this really progressive forum for dialoguing about cutting-edge science of mind. And that's where we're sort of starting. So let's see here. We can move forward. Oh. So just as mapping the human genome greatly stimulated research at both basic science levels and had created a myriad of clinical applications, mapping the meditative mind is an initiative that holds great promise for getting to understand the mind at a really rich level in the intersection between modern psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and the contemporary Dharma movement. And so what I hope to demonstrate today is what the landscape in the mind of a meditator, of an expert meditator, really may look like across networks of brain functioning, and how we're beginning to map out mindful awareness using Shinzen's basic mindfulness system. So I also will challenge you a little bit today. I'm going to ask you to leave this room with 9 bits of information, okay? So if you leave this room and you're like, what were the 9 bits? Then come to our meeting later so we can make sure you have those 9 bits, okay? So four systems of self-processing that are modulated by mindfulness-based meditation practices. And this is great because Gary sort of set up some of the systems that I'll be talking about, and we may disagree a little bit about why the narrative self may be important or not important, but I think we can agree that we spend a lot of time hanging out there, for sure. And then the 5 points that I want you to remember are 5 salient data points that came from our research study. Okay? So how do we do this? How do we create this map? Well, I am part of a functional neuroimaging laboratory. If you can just click on the little animation there, it's always nice to see. And what we do is we're a team of interdisciplinary research investigators at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital that use an approach called neurophenomenology. And this approach is focused on combining fMRI and first-person self-report. So we can get a sense of what's going on in the mind of a meditator and to clarify the nature of mind in a comprehensive way. Okay? So in order to begin constructing this map of neurophenomenology, we've constructed conceptual models, and that's where we started. And we use these conceptual models to dismantle many of the cognitive and psychological processes that are going on in these mindfulness-based meditation practices, and they have an underlying neurobiological framework. And so if you're interested in what we created in terms of the systems and the processes and the neurobiological framework that we set up, then you can just check out these two references, and one that's most recently and that will be published very soon in Annals of your Academy of Sciences. Okay, so what else have we done? We've begun to test these models in meditation practitioners, and most importantly, we have focused on the spectrum of experience across experience and proficiency in these meditators, right? So this is sort of, this level of analysis speaks to the metaphor that Kenneth Folk was talking about yesterday, this idea of contemplative fitness, right? So we really want to understand what happens as you move from a novice practitioner, okay, all the way through to expertise, and as the meditator flexes the mental muscle. What's going on? What's changing in the brain? Not just taking a slice of meditators, you put them all in the same scanner and you say, in 5 minutes, meditate, and we want to know what happened. No, we want to know what's going on throughout from the point zero, where you start meditation for the first time, all the way to people who have been doing this for 11,000 hours of practice at least, right? And what's important, one of the take-home messages here is that you'll see that there's differences in the brain across this spectrum, and that's something we need to be really clear about. Okay, what have we really done here? First sort of study to do this was a collaboration with Shinzen Young.
That was meant to be a joke. I hope you understand that. We were trying to look like mad scientists.
That's right. So these are the mad scientists.
Or demented.
Right. But I should emphasize, we're not really tied to any or wedded to any particular meditation practice or model in particular. We just happen to think that Shinzen's basic mindfulness system is really well articulated for these purposes. But he will go into a little bit more on his system and how this fits into the overall big picture after me. So we have this map that we're constructing and attempts to test our models and begin to identify the critical neural elements and the relationship between those elements, right, in specific forms of meditation that cultivate mindful awareness. And such a map can be used as a diagnostic tool, for navigation of progress by the practitioner, which some people are already using. So Gary referred to a friend and colleague of mine, Judd Brewer. I'll mention him another time. And he's using real-time feedback to sort of give progress, to allow the practitioner to assess where they are. And also for targets for therapeutic purposes. So I'm in the Department of Psychiatry, and this is going to be incredibly helpful for identifying what a flourishing mind looks like. Okay, that's really important. So another important aspect of our map is to determine where in the brain we should start looking for transformation. And the clearest answer has really been to start with a sense of self, right? The experience of me across moments of self-processing. And so we have identified 4 systems of self-processing that happen across the moments of time. And moments of me can really refer to perception and cognition. So there's a lot of things happening in the time scale, is everything that's happening at the non-conscious level to more evaluative sort of systems, right? So what are these 4 systems? Remember I said 9 pieces of information, right? So here's 4. We're going to start with 4. Now I'm going to start showing you pictures of brains, and I don't want you to be scared, and some of you may not have familiarity with brains, but I will try to be very colorful in the way I describe them.
That could be taken in various ways.
Yes. Right.
I think he meant functional neuroanatomy.
Functional neuroanatomy. Don't pay attention. Don't pay attention so much to the little abbreviations inside the brain. It's not as important, but I gave colors. Pay attention to the colors, and each color represents a system, a network, all right? So the first system is this narrative self system that Gary just set it up beautifully. So I think you should have a clear sense of what that system is. It's also referred to as the default mode network, and that's because we spend the majority of our time there, right? Okay, so that's a whole bunch of brain areas. One of the brain areas he pointed out happens to be the 2 nodes, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. And that's very much a very strong part of this network, and it'll make sense when we talk about the data soon, okay? Another system is the experiential self system, and so we're going to start adding layers to this, okay? And so the experiential system is kind of an off, kind of P like yellow, I guess in this color. But it's the experiential system, and this is the I, the now, the sensory, but it's also actually a little bit involved with areas involved with working memory. So how do you keep the sensation that you're experiencing in the moment, right now? You're keeping it in your mind. There's an aspect of keeping that sort of sensory experience in your mind in the moment, and that's an aspect of working memory. It involves some of these lateralized networks that, again, Gary pointed out by a colleague and friend of mine, Norm Farb. He showed that you can make a difference between narrative and the experiential, right? So, okay, so there's two networks. Another one is the non-conscious self system, okay? This is the stuff that's going on under the hood, so to speak. These are the non-conscious sensory affective motor processing. This is the embodied action of you interacting with the world. How your body, it sort of defines the self-processing as you interact with the world, right? It's the action tendencies. It's the motivational drive and intention that creates your behavior, okay? Automatized cognition, the habits of mind that you're used to just doing is located in this network. And these are in the blue structures, okay? And then we have an integrative control system, and it's in orange. And this network seems to be really critical in terms of meditation practitioners, because what it helps to do is integrate information coming from the exterior and the internal environment. It's also really involved in controlling cognition in a very top-down way, not necessarily suppressing the other parts of the brain, but actually integrating information much more efficiently. So the most important point you want to take from this system is that it allows you to flexibly switch between all the other aspects of self-processing. That means that you can move voluntarily, with, I believe, free will, between a narrative. I am a cognitive neuroscientist, and I somewhat believe in free will. I don't have good evidence for there being something otherwise, but I'm open to anything. But there is a way that you can flexibly switch. You know when you're in the narrative. To know that you're in the narrative allows you to switch. And that meta-awareness is something that this integrative network is really good at helping you do. And to provide the meta-awareness you need to know where you are so you can switch. You can sit and stay in your narrative, but be aware that you're in your narrative. And actually, there's some good research to show, I know a lot of neuroscientists are showing now that the narrative is bad, default mode system is not good for happiness, but there are some data that suggest that being in the narrative actually enhances creativity. So there is some use for being in the narrative, and I'll just emphasize that. And I'd love to just talk with Gary maybe afterwards about it. Okay, so 4 systems, right? Right? You guys remember them now? We got the narrative, right? You got the experiential, the non-conscious, and the integrative. Just leave with those 4 systems, and that's great. But then we'll try to get to the data. All right. All right. So what did Shinzen and I do? I'm only circling these because actually the anterior insula and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and actually even the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex switch between experiential and integrative. They overlap. So these aren't really discrete systems. There is a lot of overlap too. But this is the best way that people have shown that these networks will fire together usually and be connected functionally and anatomically through different studies. Okay? All right. So what do we do? Phase 1. So here's us in a happy state, standing in the same place in front of the scanner room. And there's Shinzen in front of the Harvard Medical School quad. Okay, so what did we do? We ended up with 15 adept meditators with a range of experience between 1,000 and 11,000 hours of experience. No current psychopathology, drug abuse, history of structural brain disease, yada, yada, yada. This was really important, though, to do this because we know that a lot of these sort of exclusionary criteria may potentially confound our results. And that's one of the actually pitfalls of doing this type of research is that we need to find meditators that have sort of this clean history, and it's quite... It was quite difficult, we'll just put it that way. But that's not to say that there's value in looking at psychopathology history as well. All right. So what did we do here? All right, so we used the basic mindfulness system, and here's sort of the basic grid. But we wanted to focus on the part of the grid, restful states. that would be particularly interesting comparison to the common baseline resting state that is used in the majority of fMRI studies. And this is where contemplative science has completely revolutionized imaging research, because our baseline state has always been, let your mind freely wander without thinking about anything in particular. Now, for most people, that's not a problem. And it's been a pretty effective baseline state. For meditators, it was a little bit of a challenge to ask them to let their mind freely wander. The first question that came to mind was, well, where do you want our minds to wander to? So, in any case, we could talk about those difficulties later. But we thought this would give us a really rich amount of data on concentration power in a state of meditative tranquility. So what were the states that we were interested in? I'll briefly describe these, and Shinzen could go into them more in detail later. But C-rest was a focus on grayscale blank that replaces mental imagery. Hear rest is focused on the absence of inner speech. Feel rest is focused on viscerosomatic relaxation in the body. And do nothing was a form of absolute rest that if you're familiar with Shinzen's techniques, really describes an effortless sustaining of awareness and clarity of mind without explicit intentional selection. Is there something you want to add to those? Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I would just say this is my reworking of things like Dzogchen, just sitting, choiceless awareness.
So that's really important to keep in mind.
Open presence. There's a whole range of things historically, and I just formulated it in a certain way. The C-rest is reworking of the nimitta and kasina practices. So I guess I would say that.
Okay. Well, so this is actually really helpful, because when we start to look at the data and compare it to other people's data, it's important that we have that sort of common language.
The feel rest maps onto a quality called prashabdi or pasadi in the jhanic system, very roughly speaking. So they all have historical antecedents. I just sort of modernized the language and reworked it slightly.
All right, so that's what we looked at. And what did we do in terms of the analyses? There's Shinzen sitting in the scanner. He's all happy, coming out after like hours of sitting in the meditation scanner, testing these models out. So what we did is we contrasted, and imaging is all about, you need a contrast for the general linear model is what we usually use. And you need a contrast. So we looked at all these different contrasts, but I'm going to focus on, for the sake of time, the do nothing contrast. It seemed to have the most interesting findings. So
MW stands for mind wandering.
That's right. So what did they do while on the scanner? So this box, these colorful boxes here, represent all the states that I've just described to you. 5 minutes of meditation time, interspersed with 2.5 minutes of this mind wander state that was a non-meditative state. Okay? And during that time, we weren't just interested in what most people do in imaging, is they just average what's going on during each of these blocks. Okay? And averaging is the way science works, but we were interested in very particular aspects of the practice. And what we wanted to do, because this is sort of a neurophenomenological approach, is peak states of clarity. Okay? So what they did was they indicated with a finger press when they feel that they've reached a peak state of clarity, also described as clear contact with a particular state in which they're meditating, and that state is intensely present. Okay?
So the clarity means a clear contact with see rest, hear rest, or feel
Right.
rest.
If they grossly lost concentration, they were to press with a thumb press. And if they were back in, they would indicate with another finger press. And if they went deeper, they would just indicate with another finger press. So we had beautiful time marks within the whole 32.5-minute run. We did 4 of those runs for each person. And we could then model those particular states. So we can then look at just the times that they went into this peak state of clarity, before they went into the clarity, afterwards, when there was gross loss of concentration. And these are things that we can do for years from now and look at these things. So here's one subject, for example, who had about 6,000 hours of experience. This is one run of 32.5 minutes, or 1,951 seconds. And each 6 represents a button press that they were peak state of clarity, and a 7 indicates when they grossly lost concentration. Okay? And these numbers actually represent the quality in which the practitioner rated that particular run on a scale of 1 to 10. Okay? So that just gives you a sense of what they did. So, okay, here's our 5 salient points. You remember the 4 systems, and now we're going to give you the 5 salient points. And I have to give you a caveat. A Buddhist scholar, a friend of mine, John Dunn, said you have to make people believe that you're not showing them where enlightenment is in the brain. So here's the caveat that these blobs don't represent the state of meditation directly. They're a representation of the relative activity in each state versus a non-meditative state. So that's the best we can do at this point. We are using other very specific novel methods instead of the general linear model to look at some of these states. There were some unique states that were experienced in the scanner that we can talk about at the breakout session. But this is general linear model. Okay, so let me just navigate you what's going on here. So here's our little diagram of those 4 systems that we talked about. Here's a brain, and it's a sagittal cut in this case, so right down the middle. And I'm going to walk you through each of those 5 points. The first one I'm going to talk about is the posterior cingulate cortex / precuneus. It sort of overlaps in that boundary. And what you see in this graph, I wonder if this is this a laser pointer?
Yes.
Maybe. I'll just point.
At the top of it, there's an icon there.
I'll just point. Okay, so what you see here is a graph of the 13 meditators that were scanned that had good data, and the percent Bowles signal change from baseline. All right? And so what you see on average, really, it's on average, what you see is a decrease, and blue represents decrease, of activity in this posterior cingulate cortex. And that's what that Gary was referring to. That means that's one of the nodes in the narrative network. Okay? The narrative network. This is one of the major nodes. And you have decreases across most of the practitioners. So there's a few interesting things here. First of all, let me just say that, again, I'll use the same slide that Gary showed, is that good friend of mine, Judd Brewers, showed also that there was decreases in this area. And he showed that what he showed basically was that there was decreases in these meditators in this particular brain region at about 0.5% from the baseline. And what we showed was not only the same findings, but it went down to as low as 15% from baseline. So that's pretty significant in intensity and magnitude change. But something that's really interesting that's striking that came about is the meditators that had the most amount of formal sitting meditation practice actually had increases in this area. And so what this means to us is that it may not be relevant to suppress this brain area as you become extremely or much more advanced in this particular type of practice. Okay, so that's something we need to really think about. Okay, that was number 1. Number 2, the frontal polar cortex. We showed increases in the right frontal polar cortex. Okay, that's frontal polar, meaning right in the front. It is the most highly advanced part of our brain. It's the most recently evolved part of our brain. Between 2 and 3 million years ago, early hominids started to use language, fire, and tools. And if you look at the Australopithecus, I think I have a picture. Let's see. If you look at Australopithecus around that time, this guy right here, Sediba, all right, started to have a different cranium. The skull actually grew in this particular region, making the sort of relationship between this area, the frontal polar cortex, and what distinguishes us from non-human primates: language, self-reflection, fire use, tool use. That all happened around that time, and that's when the frontal polar cortex developed. It happens to be just one of the most highly developed brain areas. A lot of people don't really know what it's intended for. This one describes it as selectively mediating human ability to hold in mind goals while exploring and processing secondary goals. Okay? It also has been implicated in meta-awareness, in prospective memory, very higher order cognitive function. And here we are with these meditators showing almost, the top 3 meditators, almost 60% change in Bowl response. This never happens in neuroimaging research. In neuroimaging research, you get between 0.5 and 1% Bowl signal change. That's significant. This is 60%. That's huge. And it's not artifact. We're really confident that it's not artifact because there's a very clear relationship with the hours of meditation practice.
What's the relationship to the prefrontal cortex?
Well, it's part of your prefrontal cortex. It just happens to be the most anterior part.
It's the most frontal part.
Most frontal. So
prefrontal.
there's the frontal polar, there's dorsolateral on the side, and there's orbital. So let me just make it clear that ventral medial prefrontal cortex is part of that default mode network. Ventral medial meaning the bottom side and the middle. okay, that usually goes together with the PCC, the posterior cingulate cortex, with the narrative self. And that's usually what suppresses limbic system activity for emotion regulation. In this case, what you have is not suppression of the limbic system. You just have focused concentration, equanimity, and clarity going on in these states, right? And it's happening frontal polar and dorsal lateral actually too. So this is point 2. Point 3, well, I'll tell you about point 4 actually relates more to point 3. But so point 3 is the striatum. This was also a massive increase, about 10% signal change maximum, but across all practitioners, you had increases in the striatum. This is point 3, right? So what this area is showing that the non-conscious network, and one of the main nodes in the non-conscious network is the striatum. It's important for skill learning. Okay, skill learning, meaning as you get better at doing something, it frees up your resources, your main cognitive resources, to be available to deal with the world. And you just automatize it. And that's what's going on. It's suggesting that the meditators are very automatized in their ability to do these practices. It's no longer as effortful, and it's just highly automatic. And it could be related to also this motivational drive, a continuous motivational drive or intention as they continue to do the practice. So very significant finding as well. Okay, number 4, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is an experiential network finding. It's keeping your working memory in the moment. This is also related to the experiential network that Gary referred to in Norm Farb's study. And again, you had a 25% bowl signal change. So these increases that we're seeing are massive. I mean, these are all add up. So, but it's important that we look across expertise, not just put all people together and sort of see what goes on an average. We need to look across expertise. Okay, the last salient point, this is the 5th, and it's sort of 5 and 6, but it sort of goes together because they're part of the limbic system. And what I wanted to make clear here is that usually, like I said before, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is an evaluative brain area. We use it a lot. That's our narrative. We need to evaluate the world constantly. And so that brain area typically is suppressing the limbic system because that's a form of regulating our emotion. If we want to suppress emotion reactivity, that one of the biggest researchers in the field, James Gross, talks about suppression, avoidance, reappraisal. These are all cognitive ways of reducing activity in your amygdala and hippocampus. What you have here is a pretty massive decrease in the amygdala and the hippocampus. Here's the hippocampus, and here's the amygdala. Okay, massive decreases there, but not through suppression, through awareness. That's huge. So I'm going to actually be talking about this with James Gross at one of the biggest Association for Behavioral Cognitive Therapy meeting in November in Tennessee, because he's showing that you can regulate the amygdala and hippocampus through suppression and reappraisal, and now we're going to show that you can do it just through awareness. So the modulation of the limbic system through awareness. Wow.
That's a novel finding.
That's
of
huge.
Basic science.
No one's shown that. Yeah. Very cool. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just summarize everything, okay? So here's a lot of pictures of brains. But we have decreases in the narrative networks with the PCC. We have so I'll go back and forth here. So the circles sort of go to the areas. We have increases in the striatum, okay, and the non-conscious networks. Decreases in the amygdala, also part of the non-conscious network. So it's not always just a suppression of non-conscious systems, but in some cases it's important to look at the substrates individually and see how they work. But in general, these are the systems that are affected by the meditation practices. We have great increases in the frontal polar cortex, okay, an integrative network. There's actually part of the anterior medial prefrontal cortex is also part of that network. It's also high, but you can see it up there, very high activity. Also in the left, a little bit, okay? And some of the inferior parietal lobe area, also part of that network. And then increases in the experiential network, so dorsolateral prefrontal areas. You've decreased activity in some of the aspects of the sensory cortex, but in other levels you have really strong increases in sensory. So there seems to be a really strong focus towards sensory experience in general, but just more oriented towards focus in this sort of frontal polar area. Okay, so there's sort of the summary, right? There's 5 points. One was PCC, one was striatum, one was frontal polar cortex, right? The other one was dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the last one was hippocampus and amygdala or limbic system. Those are the five points, right? So we had 9 total. All right, take-home message on average meditators show posterior cingulate cortex relative decreases. However, the highest level of expertise show more activity. Increases in activity in the dorsal striatum. It's part of the non-conscious network. This could be related to motivational drive and automated cognition. Across levels of experience, expert meditators increase relative activity in the frontal polar cortex and dorsolateral, showing parts of the integrative and experiential networks, and decreases in relative activity in the limbic system. And so this really provides support for the models that we've been creating, which is great. So where are we now? So that was phase 1 for our study with Shinzen, basic mechanisms, experienced meditators. What we need now is really to finish the study, and we're going to compare the results of phase 1 to the brain changes of novice meditators. And to do this, we're also trying to build a whole contemplative neuroscience research program at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And I think that's one of the most important things that we're trying to do. I feel committed to bringing these types of practices and these contemplative wisdom traditions to mainstream hospitals like Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I really hope that we can do that. So we are looking for help, and so
the subtle hint pending required financial resources.
So if you do have some interest in helping us, there's ways to do that, and I can talk to you afterwards. Okay, just from acknowledgments to our lab. David Silberswag and Emily Stern direct the lab, and to all the people there, the Impact Foundation who supported some of the work that we were doing, to Shinzen, and thanks to you guys. Thank you for being here. All right, Shin, all you.
Okay.
He's going to give us the big picture.
That was brilliant.
Oh, great.
We had a lot of discussion about how we were going to try to handle this. It's phenomenal.
Oh, good.
I was really impressed. Okay. So that was pretty heady. This is going to be more for fun. I am going to frame what we've done, these results, within the broad sweep of human history. First, I'd like to say a little bit more about blobology. I would like you to learn that word. That's actually a useful word to know. It's a word that professional neuroscientists use among themselves to remind themselves how primitive our current state of neuroscience is. Okay, we show you these colored blobs, and it creates an impression in the general public that we know a lot more than we actually know. And maybe that's okay, it creates sizzle and so forth. But the one thing that I learned getting involved in this field, sort of not being professionally trained, but sort of entering it from the side, is how really you have to just sort of lower the bar, okay, and really realize we're just starting. There is a huge potential in this kind of research, but I notice that when I talk to people about this research, they sort of nod their head and say, oh yeah, as though, oh well, of course you could show these stunningly statistically credible results. Well, yeah, of course there would be changes in the brain that you could see. People don't realize how hard it is to actually demonstrate that. I just want to mention that. We're just at the beginning of something that could revolutionize the course of human history. But we are just starting. And I think that the results that we got are a significant contribution to this worldwide endeavor that's going on, and I think will be an important zeitgeist for the 21st century. So I just wanted to say that off at first. So a number of years ago, I went to Harvard Medical School, Dave's lab, and I gave them a pitch. Some of you may know in the entertainment industry what it means to give a pitch. You give a presentation and you try to convince someone that they should get involved in what you have to offer. So I gave them a pitch. I said, I've designed a system of practice that's based on mindfulness, but broadly draws from the whole of human contemplative history. And I designed it specifically to be convenient for scientific research. And I think that if you use this system, you will get stunningly impressive results and perhaps novel results. The head of the lab, Dr. Silberswag, sort of sat me down and said, well, you know, we might not get any results, or if we get the results, they might be the results you don't want, and we're going to still publish them. And I said, well, of course, because that's the only way that science can work. And when we started, to tell you the truth, if it had turned out that we got no results, I would not have been surprised in the slightest. I would not have been surprised at all. I am actually quite surprised that we got this good results. That's how hard it is to get good results in this field. So, you know, broadly speaking, that's the significance. So let me see here. This is my little presentation. I call it Divide and Conquer, Structuralism Revisited. Now, a lot of people don't like this phrase, divide and conquer. It sounds sort of imperialistic, but I love it. The Buddha discovered divide and conquer. If you can break down the elements of, that produce self moment by moment, you could use the 5 skandhas, the 4 material elements, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. There are numerous canonical deconstructions of selfhood. But if you can break the sense of self down into its components, you can see, you will conquer suffering and the screwed up behavior that comes through suffering. So this is just the phrase I like to use. If you find this offensive, then you can substitute the phrase untangle and be free for the phrase divide and conquer. So we're going to go down a little journey down the pathway of history. Starting here we are. You've seen this picture before. We didn't correlate our shows too well, but we start here. We're doing research that we just presented to you. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because several decades ago, expert first persons, that is to say expert observers from the inside, introspection experts, started to dialogue with experts in a third-person approach. A third-person approach means, well, what's going on neurophysiologically in your brain? So the reason we're doing this is that in the late 20th century, this started. So here's Richie Davidson dialoguing with the Dalai Lama, third-person expert, first-person expert, could see some obvious chemistry. And there's dialoguing going on here. So we're able to do this because the Mind and Life Institute created, they were clever. They got a celebrity and they created sizzle around the notion of the science, contemplative dialogue, third-person, best of the West, first-person introspection, best of the East, what's going to happen if they could cross-fertilize, what kind of children will be born, I would say that right now they're sort of seriously dating. That's where we are historically. We'll see where this leads. So now, what preceded the late 20th century was the mid-20th century. This paradigm dominated. This is called behaviorism. There's B.F. Skinner, torturing pigeons. Here's John Watson, messing around with the baby. So this was behaviorism, mid-20th century, dominant paradigm. These people react, so in a sense, we're reacting to them, but these people reacted to their predecessors, who were these people here. The founding fathers and mothers of depth psychology, Freud, Adler, Jung, Reich, Klein, Horney, etc. This was a dominant paradigm at an earlier period. Somewhat contemporaneous, but also somewhat preceding these people historically. Most people know this name, they would know this name. But behind these people are names that people no longer remember, but I think really had a lot to say. These people, particularly this person here, Edward Titchener, who started something called structuralism. Behind Titchener was Wilhelm Wundt, who started the first psychological laboratory. You can see he was born in 1832, so we're really going back in history. And Wundt studied with one of the towering physicists of the 19th century, Hermann von Helmholtz. So this is hard science. Now, he wanted to take a hard-nosed look. He was not a psychoanalyst type, okay? But he wanted to look in a very scientific way at experience. His protege was Titchener. I'm going to talk more about him. Titchener is not remembered much. If you look in the history of psychology, he's remembered for starting something called structuralism, which is usually characterized as a dead end. He's also remembered for giving out the first Ph.D. in psychology to a woman when women were not given degrees, and he had to buck the culture of Victorian world. Margaret Washburn got her Ph.D. in psychology from Titchener. Everyone knows the word empathy. Most people don't know it was coined by Edward Titchener, that word. So what was the idea that Titchener had, and also Wundt preceding? Well, they said, how did we go? Let's look at the history of science. I'm a big advocate that scientists should carefully study the history of science. So that's what they did. They said, okay, how did we go from alchemy? Here we have alchemy. This is like 16th century stuff, which was sort of a pseudoscience. Here's the elements according to one alchemical system. It's very archetypal, but not really much grounded in physical experiment. It's not quantified at all. I could go on and on. This is a very interesting chart. But this is the paradigm, not a very good analysis of the material world from our modern point of view. And this was the way of working. It was semi-magical. He's holding torches, trying to manipulate cosmic forces. It's great for religion, but maybe not so good for hard science. So people like Wundt and Titchener asked themselves, well, how did we go from alchemy to chemistry? So now I'm going to show you a slide that will contrast with alchemy. I'm going to show you a modern chemistry lab. You may recognize the cultural homage. So how did this transition happen? Well, it happened because of this. Mendeleev and others created this really good grid that, I could go on and on about this, just how much is in here. But this is a quantified and dimensionally independent divide and conquer. You've divided it into elements and you're exploring the relationship between the elements, and lo and behold, you go from this confusing plethora of hundreds of thousands of substances, now millions of substances, to a pretty simple picture. So Titchener said, okay, let's figure out the basic components of sensory experience, and then we'll be able to understand how self arises. And they took as their metaphor the transition from alchemy to chemistry. So Titchener had his sort of periodic table of sensory elements. I'm not going to have time to go into this, but here he is, and here's sort of how he organized things, qualities versus elements here. It almost sort of looks like the periodic table a little bit. An amazing amount of, or there are an amazing number of similarities between how he decided to break things up and how I ultimately decided to break things up, which is, I find sort of interesting. Okay, so Titchener had this, he called it structuralism. But he was not the first person to come up with this notion. Not at all. Who was the first person to come up with this notion? Okay, a long, long time ago. I pulled this off of the Wikipedia. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi's book. It's the Abhidhammatta Sangaha, where you have the 5 aggregates here, and you've got the 12 ayatanas, you've got the 5 skandhas, you've got the indriyas, you've got a total of these dharmas or ultimate realities, et cetera, et cetera. So this is another periodic table of sensory experience. So the Buddha was the first to come up with this notion of that it would be useful to break things down into their components, that you would get insights from untangling these elements. So there's the Abhidharma table of sensory elements. So based on what I knew about how functional neuroimaging and neuro research was done, I created my own version of all of this, and that's me. Yes, I like being in the company of those people. So we could go on and on about this. We won't in detail. By the way, all of this is on the internet, on YouTube, and on free articles all over the internet, so you can see that. So this is basically what I pitched to the Brigham and Women Harvard Medical School Neuro Lab. That, hey, if you use this system, you're gonna, it might help you. So Einstein said something very interesting. He said, true human worth is measured by the magnitude and direction of liberation from self. Now, something that has magnitude, yeah, this is an authentic Einstein quote, by the way. Okay, so he's implying that self is a kind of vector, that it has components, and that's what a periodic table of elements of self do. So I am not going to have time to actually do any of this, unfortunately, as cool as it is, because we're running sort of late. Well, actually, maybe I have more time, right? Because I have 12 minutes. Okay, well, I'm going to run through it. Listen, Dave's presentation was so great. If you just got that, you got your money's worth. Okay, so Titchener had this great idea, divide and conquer. We'll find a periodic table of sensory elements, and then we'll be able to make a true science of psychology, a true science of sensory experience, a true science of thought, emotion, and human happiness. Now, I think he was on the right track. For one thing, it maps onto Buddhism. I doubt that he knew that. But it's always cited as a dead end and a failure. And here's the reasons, why it's cited as such. It failed to produce measurable outcomes. It failed to produce a simple model. It failed to produce means of helping people. Training informants was difficult, and informants sometimes did not agree on their experience. So it seems to me that we have two things available now to us that Wundt and Titchener would not have had in the Victorian and Edwardian age. What we have available now is the beginning of high-resolution neuroimaging technology. You notice I said the beginning. But our ability to image brain function grows and grows and grows. Year by year, decade by decade, our real-time movies of this is your brain on this is your brain on that, our movies are getting better and better. They're not very great now, but they're blobology now, but it will improve. So we have neuroimaging technology, and the other thing we have is a knowledge of Buddhist practice and similar practices, mindfulness. So I would claim that what we did at Harvard is in the lineage of these pioneers, these pre-Freudian pioneers at the very origin of the Western study of consciousness, these people that wanted to be rigorously scientific and took the periodic table of elements as their model, I think we're in a position to vindicate their basic approach because we live in a different age. And so this is the advent of mindfulness in the West, and the advent and the ever-improving neuroimaging is going to allow us to address each one of these failings and perhaps correct it and grow from it. So let's take these failings one at a time. Failed to produce measurable outcomes. Well, you just saw some pretty impressive measurable outcomes. That's what our neuroimaging allows for. Okay. Didn't have a simple model. Well, here's a simple model. This is the one that I use. Pretty simple. You could see interactions between these elements that explain, remember I said appreciate self and world. Here's your appreciation of the world. Here's your appreciation of the self. Mental image, mental talk, emotional body sensations, the causal arrows, the relationships go back and forth. This stuff can trigger this stuff. So that's a fairly simple model. Didn't help people? Well, mindfulness-based everything is definitely helping people. Training of the observers was inefficient. Well, that's because they didn't know about this kind of stuff, that you could train people with posture and systematic focusing techniques. Well, we now know that. And we can train the observers this way. Now, the next one is very interesting. Agreement. Between the invention of the microscope and a final agreement on the cell theory of life, 200 years passed. People looked through the awareness extending tools and argued about what they were seeing for almost 2 centuries before science came to a consensus. So I give you this as a kind of optimistic example that we're just now beginning a real dialogue across traditions. We're just now beginning. And so in 200 years, we may have a consensus science of enlightenment. May. I'm not saying necessarily will, but could happen. So whose paradigm? Look at here. You must realize your true self, Ramana Maharshi. I totally agree with him. You must realize there truly is no self, the Buddha. I totally agree with him. Now this is sort of messed up, but you must sweat tears and piss blood. That's the Zen approach. That's the Saki Roshi, by the way. Here you have Papaji saying, call off the search. So is it about sweating tears and pissing blood or calling off the search? I agree with him, and I agree with him, 100%. So that's 400% agreement on paradigm. Whose stages? The 1750 koans, the 10 bodhisattva levels, the 5 ranks, the 10 oxherding pictures. It's not 100. The slide got messed up. The 16 stages of insight, the 5 paths. It's in Tibetan practice. Well, this is starting to dialogue too, because these path models apparently seem similar but very different. So here's what I think about agreement. The combination of a lot of people doing these techniques with our ability to observe objective correlates based on the subjective reports, plus this frank and collegial, uncensored dialogue that is exemplified by what happens at Buddhist Geeks. I have the Dharma Overground website here. People really talking about what they're really experiencing. Here's the Dalai Lama and a Trappist monk. Getting down to the nitty-gritty. This is not a theological discussion. This is a discussion about what happens to us when we practice. I would think that a combination of a lot of people doing powerful techniques plus some objective way to sort of validate or disconfirm people's subjective claims, plus this kind of dialoguing could solve the agreement among informants problem that was said to be one of the dead ends of structuralism. So these are the reasons why I think there's a basis for optimism. And I'm going to have to, unfortunately, skip that. This is a pictorial representation of the system that I teach. We already went over this, didn't we? 3 goals. You work with your sensory experience, what you see inner and outer, what you hear inner and outer, what you experience in your body emotionally and physically. I teach, and you apply concentration, clarity, and equanimity. That's my definition of mindful awareness. So you bring this is the overall paradigm of the basic mindfulness system. You bring concentration, clarity, and equanimity to your inner and outer visual, auditory, and somatic experiences. I have 3 basic strategies for doing that: noting, do nothing, and nurture positive. Noting is noting from the Mahasi tradition. Do nothing is, as I said, a sort of knockoff on choiceless awareness. And nurture positive is a vast generalization of loving kindness practice. So these are 3 basic approaches. These are 3 basic skills. That's why I call it basic mindfulness. There's basis vectors here. And it has 3 characteristics. I wanted to create a system that was science-friendly. Differential equation iconically represents that. I wanted to create a system that was interactive and algorithmic so that you could be coached through automated software or live coaching, but it was real-time interactive. I found that that was the best way to teach and support people in their practice. The usual paradigm is, here's the mudra, here's the posture, here's the cushion, there's the wall, go face it, come back in an hour or a day or 2. But I found that touching base every 3 or 4 minutes was a much more effective way to both teach and support people in practice. So, so that's an algorithm. And I wanted it to produce the classic results, not to be watered down in the slightest. I'm one of those people that is comfortable talking about stream entry, enlightenment. I'm not afraid of the E word, etc. So those are some of the salient features of the system represented as a kind of mandala. So will science, technology interacting with spirituality, what will that produce a kind of radical change for the better on the planet? It's possible. But we also have to be honest. I'm pretty optimistic that something dramatic and good and fast and global could happen as the result of this cross-fertilization. But we can't say for sure. You'll remember, you may remember the thing about, I've got two pills, the red pill and the blue pill, you know. So we can't say for sure where this is going to end. But I'm going to be advocating that we take the red pill here and explore this. And we're done. That's it. So,
well, wasn't that an uber geeky morning? So now we have a lunch break. We can meet back here at 2 for our unplugged sessions. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, comments, need to dialogue about this last presentation, both Shinzen and Dave will be doing an unplugged session, so check that out. And if you have other conversations that you want to facilitate or join, please check the unplugged board in the back, and we'll see you back here at 2 p.m. Have a great lunch.